Hello and welcome to the next episode of When Tomorrow Comes. I'm Charlotte Orrell, Senior Futures Consultant in the Iceni Futures team. And this week I am joined by some of our Iceni contingency to take a look at the proposed updates to the NPPF and the draft National Model Design Code. So this isn't a full review of the NPPF. The government makes it very clear that it is simply an update to take into account policy changes in response to the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission Living with Beauty report, and that a full review is likely to take place in respect to the white paper recommendations in a couple of years to come. So despite that, it does have some interesting additions and alterations, and one of these is a requirement that local authorities should prepare design codes based upon principles set out in the National Design Guide, and as part of that, we've obviously seen a draft National Model Design Code. And joining me today to discuss the changes, proposed new code and the changes in the NPPF. We've got a variety of colleagues from a mix of different disciplines. We have two calls for confusion, one from our design team and one for our economics team. Hello to you both. Hi. We're also fortunate to be joined by not another Paul, but the wonderful Narita from our heritage and townscape team. So Paul, it seems the most sensible starting point is to begin with yourself to give us a high-level review of those proposed changes to the NPPF.
Yes, thanks. I mean, most of the changes relate to policy on the quality of design of new developments, which themselves respond to the recommendations of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. I mean, Paul, the other Paul, is more qualified to talk about that in more detail, and he will do so in a moment or two. There were also sort of significant changes to flood risk policy, specifically to classify the vulnerability classifications, as well as listing out what is and isn't a water compatible development. A lot of the changes, however, are really just tightening up the wording in order to enable a better interpretation of the policy. This might have come about just through various planning appeals or examinations in public, which have resulted in certain interpretations which may not or may well have been MHCLG's intention for those specific policies. One of the main policies changes in terms of tightening up the wording, it relates to paragraph 11, which is the famous paragraph relating to the presumption in favour of sustainable development. Now, the previous wording said that these policies should positively seek opportunities, or local authorities should positively seek opportunities to meet the development needs of their areas and be sufficiently flexible to adapt to rapid change. Now, in strengthening the wording to that, it now reads that all plans should promote a sustainable pattern of development that seeks to meet the development needs of their area. What a new addition to that is that there is now a requirement, or a clearer requirement at least, to align growth and infrastructure, and also to improve the environment, mitigate climate change, including by making effective use of land in urban areas, and to adapt to its effect. So it's seeking those that in plan making terms and sustainable development terms, make it much more clearer that there is a much wider onus on just delivering this sustainable development in terms of infrastructure, and also being proactive against mitigating climate change, etc. In relation to decision taking, the Article 4 directions can only be used to remove national permitted development rights, allowing changes of use to residential where they are targeted and fully justified. Now, the amendment is to paragraph 53 on that particular topic. In relation to my area of expertise, so I'm just getting emails pinging through, apologies if you can hear that. There's a little bit of confirmation on the housing delivery test. Now, previously that was subject to transitional arrangements, but after the 3-year period, which has now elapsed, that the wording relating to the transitional period has been removed. So it's really just confirming that the housing delivery test is now fully compatible. Interestingly, though, there is no changes, which is quite a hot topic at this moment in time, no changes to the policies surrounding supporting the economy or indeed town centres. Now, that might well change once there's greater clarity of what's going on with both of those things post-pandemic. I mean, that is really a very high-level summary of the changes that have come into my orbit.
Right. Thank you, Paul. Moving over to Paul number 2, do you mind giving us a summary of this National Design Code and where it sits in relation to the NPPF?
It's a tall order to say simple and high level because it's quite a complex field, but it is interesting that the radar is looking more at design from a national policy point of view. And this has stemmed from a range of things that have policies that have been put in place over time. The most recent one being the National Design Guide, which is a sort of very sterling piece of work to aid people to understand a range of design issues that they can address when approaching proposals on sites and assessing them. So the National Model Design Code is to really support that with making design elements of a site more specific, more identifiable and measurable. It's a guide that sits along a range of other guides. So design codes, I think it recognises, are never the single universal panacea, but it has to be read alongside others. It's interesting that that the authors of this have wanted them locally specific. So there's a lot of attention paid to local character, an understanding of the vernacular of the local area, and how one fits into it. It tries to reach across both urban growth areas and existing urban areas. So for existing urban areas, character studies will be critical because of the context of the area, you know, the different kinds of places that exist around development sites. The principle of it is to set a series of parameters, a little bit like the kind of parameter plans one would get in design and access statements and proposals. And perhaps a caricature of this might be that if a design and access statement is guidance and you put the same drawings in a code, then they become mandatory. So it's the mandatory nature that will be the important thing. Also, they want to get rid of ambiguous, fluffy language. They like wording to be specific, and they'd like some numbers. So, you know, is something 2-story or is it not 2-story? Is it 7-story or not 7-story? Will it give certainty? Well, I think it advances towards certainty. It won't do everything the word certainty requires. The reason for producing the guidance people will be familiar with, which is, you know, there's been talk about the quality of urban growth and whether it's achieving what people set out to achieve when they first say, yes, let's have some urban growth there. So it wants to make the generality of growth better quality. The way it sets it out as a simple sentence is, you know, a simple, concise, illustrative set of visual and numerical material that's specific to a site, and the physical nature of that site. One of the interesting things about it, again, is that it's asking them to be really locally accountable. So there is a method written into it where engagement forms part of the equation. And this is the bit that I think most people will find a hostage to fortune, because when people talk about design, they probably get veered off into talking about things that are about appearance and style, and not about actually how something works for the betterment of local people. So unpicking those things will be an interesting task, but it's a great opportunity. And one of the things I really like about having it out there is that it is going to raise the design debate, and the more the debate on design is raised, I think the better off everybody will be.
Thanks, Paul. And in terms of practicality terms, when is this going to be triggered? At what point would a local authority be thinking about the design code and who would be involved? If you're saying it's for a specific site, are we going to find that developers are more hands-on with the creation of design codes?
Historically, it has been developers who have been the creators of design codes because they're onerous to produce. This document puts the emphasis on local authorities producing the codes. They have to resource them. It's interesting, the remit, the geographic spread of the codes is up to local authorities to decide. So whether it's borough-wide, a code for the borough, or a code for a renewal area or a specific street, it's for them to decide. And that makes it very, it gives them a lot of headaches to think about how they handle that. But it's a good thing that local authorities get the opportunity to contribute and write to them, write about them.
I think that was quite interesting reading the updates, so to the NPPF, and also looking at the design code. Is obviously the renewed emphasis on sustainability to be balanced alongside design, and that sort of runs throughout. And I was just wondering how you feel that sustainability is going to take a greater role within the codes and within development and design going forward. I guess that's open to all of you to answer.
I'll have a first crack in the sense that I've just been recently talking about the content of a code that should be prepared. It's going to form part of the terms of an outline application. And I'd put into it that modern methods of construction should form part of the code. In fact, this also refers to that. It was actually played down a fair bit in the discussions, partly because how would you manage that? How could you practically deal with that through the planning process? You probably can't. So even though modern methods of construction really do crank up sustainability credentials of a site, whether they're correct for a code or not is a challenging idea.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes to mind is that the design code is not something that is valid just for the short term. It should be written in a way that is valid for long term, that then makes it more sustainable, because then it takes into account the longevity of a particular site, particular developments. It takes into account the economic vibrations that might come. We know post-pandemic we're looking at a huge economic struggle to climb back, and whether the design codes which are being published or prepared now will accommodate that, especially in terms of large-scale development, which are phased, so 15 to 20 years longevity on them. Those kind of things should be incorporated. And like Paul said, construction methodology, yes, but also longevity of the materials. Are they going to be like brick that lasts for hundreds of years, or are they going to be like the cladding that is now being taken off with billions of pounds? So I think both of those aspects need to be quite considerable, they would be given considerable importance.
I guess a concern that arises from having design codes which are in place for obviously for a long period of time is obviously their flexibility. How do they adapt to changes? How do they adapt to the way we live, we work, etc. And I'm sure quite a few people will have concerns that the design codes don't offer enough flexibility. And I don't know whether that causes concern to you guys as well, or whether actually that gives you greater comfort in design going forward.
Well, first of all, you can put health checks in them. You can say this code should be reviewed in a period
every
of
5
time,
years.
5 years time. Policy moves on, demographics move on, all sorts moves on. So putting the health check in there is important. But what you seem to allude to also is, are they going to crimp people's ability to do something good? I think it takes design talent to work within constraints. And the constraints might be, as Narita's field, a historic thing. they also might be other things like how an area is changing generally. And so designers have to be creative no matter what constraints are put on them, I would argue. And they can be creative whether it's very tight or very loose.
I think that, sorry, the idea of health checks and checking things up in 5 years' time is actually reflected in some of the changes to the Article 4 direction as well. So whereas previously the Article 4 directions were essentially in place for as long as the councils wanted them to be, the changing of the wording is actually both reduced the geographic scope. So it now says that any Article 4 direction, which is essentially when permitted development is halted, that it should be in the smallest possible area to just really confine where, or to handcuff where the council's powers are located. But also that the Article 4 directive should have, or the council should at least consider a period of time for when that Article 4 direction should be up, therefore allowing those permitted developments back into play. That might just be a case of it might be 4 years when the local plans are reviewed, or it might be sooner, where if there's a substantial or seismic shift such as the pandemic, which might mean that permitted development for changing housing into, or residential uses into housing might become a little bit more or a requirement of it would be a little bit more necessary in order to support the high street, for example. I mean, I think more likely that these changes to Article 4 directives are essentially just the sort of shorts. I mean, the government's stated intention is basically to reduce the red tape around planning, and by part of doing that would be to encourage these permitted developments. And by reducing the scope of Article 4 directives, they're essentially saying, look, if you're going to use these, then we're going to limit the use of them in terms of both the areas and the time frames that they're being used to.
So a question for you, Paul, do you think a design code would reduce red tape?
Almost certainly not.
Hey.
Yes, exactly.
I thought that would be your answer.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I was going to raise, I don't want to use the resource word here, but one of the things that I, from personal experience, have had whilst writing design guidance and sort of policies for conservation areas was that I wanted to be extremely specific, whereas my planning policy colleagues pushed me away from that and said, no, you have to give flexibility. And, a comment to your earlier question, Charlotte, about, flexibility versus being specific. I was always told that being prescriptive opens you to a lot of challenges, which I found very annoying, because being prescriptive is how I feel that I would have a better control of when planning applications come on my desk. But yeah, this is something that we'll have to test, whether it is going back to being prescriptive or generic nature as planning policy officers love it.
But there's also a negative way you could read that. I'm probably agreeing with you, but if you had a code on scale and massing that said, all new housing in this urban extension, this particular quarter or neighbourhood should be 2 to 3 story, that sounds like a specific code. Well, what it means is a typical house builder will say, oh, we don't have any 3-story types. That means we're compliant to the code, putting in what we normally put in. Now that doesn't make the change that is expected. And so it's the specifics of wording and the instructions that will make them good or bad.
I have a question for Narita, if I can. Now, one of the changes to the NPPF relates to historic monuments and statues. Now, I can tell by the reaction that you're going to this question. Now, is this purely a populist move in reaction to the Black Lives Matter movements, etc., or is there actually a real requirement to protect these statues?
Well, there are two-pronged attitudes to here. The statues, monuments, etc., that are already listed need not be mentioned in the planning policy framework because they're already covered by the legislation. The NPPF new paragraph does, however, include unlisted monuments and statues.
Oh.
And I think that's where perhaps the policy extends a little bit of control, because obviously the legislation wouldn't cover them. However, how do you define one? Do you define a mural painted by Banksy as a work of art and therefore it cannot be stolen or removed? Or do you, because, you know, culturally, it is representative of our culture, it is representative of our days today. Similarly, a mural, war mural, I don't know whether you know Dalston, there's a beautiful one just outside Dalston Curve, and there was huge, you know, controversies about that. So I think the debate is open. I do think that this is being done to satisfy BAME, but I am BAME and I'm not satisfied. So it's just personally, as well as professional person, I think it is just literally a political, you know, people are trying to politically correct themselves by adding this paragraph. That's my view.
Silence from Paul. I think he appreciated that answer.
No, I mean, I suspected that it was just a purely political move, frankly. But
it's a very interesting one to include, wasn't it? I think we all pointed it out immediately.
And in terms of the red tape requirement, having to have a letter from the culture secretary to remove any statue or to make alterations to it. I mean, I hope he or she have got a large inbox and is quick to go through all of them.
Indeed.
I'm going to have to wrap this up, although this has actually been quite entertaining. A final question, which is very predictable. NPPF, planning policy at the moment, white paper, etc. The focus is on how do we build more homes? Mainly aimed at Paul M. Do the changes that are being proposed allow us to build more homes and encourage us to build more homes?
Two slightly different questions. So prior to the changes to the NPPF, there was a confirmation on changes to the standard method. Now, what these changes to the standard method have essentially done is they have transported demand based on house price affordability, i.e. that was largely in expensive areas in the southeast and the green belt around London, and they have repurposed those repurposed that 300,000 homes per annum target to urban areas where they think, on the basis that it would be more sustainable locations to have these developments. However, again, there might be a political element of it because the leafy green belt authorities were home to many Conservative MPs who were very much against the plan proposals for the changes to the standard methodology, which again really focused development in those home counties authorities. But now that's completely switched on its head, and it's moved. The burden of growth is now in the 20 largest cities in England. Now, the question that needs to be asked is whether there is demand for housing, particularly now post-pandemic in urban centres, where recent indications suggest, London at least, there has been quite a significant level of out-migration from London, whether that's temporary or permanent, or whether it's Brexit-related as well as pandemic-related. That remains to be seen, but we'll know a little bit more once data over the next 2 years comes out. But at a time when there is an exodus from the major cities, changes to the planning policy framework, or at least the guidance, which filters the majority of growth into these cities, doesn't make a huge amount of sense.
My take on it is that you know, if there is the migration out, people will be living somewhere, and if the design code approach allows people to own ideas of local growth in a way that's acceptable to them, then it will lubricate the wheels and get growth going. But what that comes with is all the things that local community want. So it's the, yes, in my backyard, people will say, we don't want 1,000 bedrooms with nothing else there because it's a dormitory for other places. What they'll want is community, placemaking, local facilities, parks, shops, good bus routes. All of that makes a town, not just houses.
Yeah.
Sustainable neighbourhoods and sustainable design, which hopefully will, say, travel through the changes in the NPPF that we're suggesting at the moment. I'm going to have to put us off there, guys. Thank you very much for your time and explaining all the proposals. The consultation for both the NPPF changes and the draft design code, I believe I'm correct in saying, is open until the 27th of March. So if you'd like to understand more, I'm sure my 3 guests today will be more than happy to explain that in more detail, and equally, if anyone needs any help in drafting the representations, we'll be more than happy to help. So for those who are listening, thank you for checking in, and I hope you will join us again next week for our predictions on real estate outlook for the year ahead. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.
Cheers, then.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.